The Fillmore East in New York City, May 10, 1968. The venue was packed wall to wall with nearly 3,000 people, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the electric anticipation that always preceded a Jimi Hendrix performance. The opening chords of Purple Haze had just ripped through the amplifiers, that iconic distorted riff that could make grown men weep and teenagers believe they could fly, when Jimi suddenly stopped playing. Not a pause for effect, not a dramatic build-up, but a complete, abrupt silence that cut through the room like a blade. His hands fell away from the strings, the feedback died, and Mitch Mitchell's drums stuttered to a confused halt. 3,000 people held their breath, unsure whether this was part of the show or something else entirely. And then Jimi did something no one in that audience would ever forget. He walked to the edge of the stage, knelt down, and reached his hand toward a small boy sitting in the front row, a child whose eyes were covered by dark glasses and whose tiny hands were gripping the edge of the stage like it was the only solid thing in a spinning world. What happened in the next 7 minutes would never appear in any official concert recording, never make it into the music press coverage of that night, and would only survive through the fragmented memories of people who were there and the testimony of one mother who, decades later, would finally tell the full story of why her 9-year-old son Thomas had been brought to that concert in the first place. The truth behind that moment reveals something about Jimi Hendrix that his public image, the wild man with the burning guitar and the psychedelic clothing, could never capture. He was a man whose own childhood pain had left him with a radar for suffering in others, especially in children, and when he saw it, he couldn't look away. To understand what Jimi saw when he looked down at that boy, we need to go back to Seattle, 1952, when Jimi himself was 9 years old and learning what it meant to be invisible. His mother Lucille was in and out of hospitals, struggling with demons that no one in the family wanted to name out loud, and his father Al worked such long hours that days would pass where Jimi barely saw him. Jimi learned early to move quietly through the world, to not ask for too much, to understand that his needs were less important than everyone else's stability. He became an expert at reading rooms, at sensing tension before it erupted, at knowing when to disappear. And he learned, in the way only neglected children learn, that the world is full of people who will look right through you as if you don't exist. His first guitar wasn't really a guitar at all. It was a broom, one string stretched between 2 nails, and he would sit in his bedroom for hours pretending to play, mimicking the sounds he heard on his father's old blues records. When Al finally brought home a real acoustic guitar from a second-hand shop, Jimi held it like it was made of glass, terrified that if he held it too tight or played it wrong, it would be taken away. He taught himself in silence, afraid that if anyone heard him practicing they would tell him he wasn't good enough, that he was wasting time, that he should be doing something useful instead. Music became his secret language, the one place where he could exist fully without needing anyone's permission. By the time Jimi was a teenager, he had learned to perform invisibility so well that teachers would forget he was in class, neighbors wouldn't remember his name, and even family members seemed surprised when he spoke. The only time anyone really saw him was when he had a guitar in his hands, and even then, it was the music they saw, not the boy creating it. This pattern followed him through his brief military service, through the grinding years of playing backup on the Chitlin circuit, and even into the early days of his fame in London. People would praise his playing, interview him for magazines, scream his name at concerts, but very few actually saw Jimi Hendrix the person, the quiet kid from Seattle who still flinched when people raised their voices and who kept waiting for someone to realize he was a fraud and send him back to the shadows where he belonged. But children were different. When Jimi encountered children, especially children who were hurting or lost or different in ways that made the world ignore them, something in him recognized a mirror. There are scattered stories, most of them unpublicized, of Jimi stopping to talk to kids who approached him on the street, or sending guitars to young musicians who wrote him letters, or visiting children's hospitals when his tour schedule happened to bring him through a city. These weren't publicity stunts. He didn't bring photographers, didn't mention them in interviews. He just did them, quietly, as if paying forward a kindness no one had ever paid him. The night of May 10, 1968, started like most Fillmore East shows. The experience had already played the venue multiple times that year, and the routine was familiar: soundcheck in the late afternoon, a few hours of rest in the tiny dressing room, then the walk to the stage through the narrow backstage corridor while the opening act finished their set. Jimi was in a decent mood that night, or at least that's what Noel and Mitch later recalled. He had been working on new material, experimenting with slower tempos and jazz influences, and he seemed excited about the creative direction even if the record label was pressuring him to deliver more hits like Purple Haze and Foxy Lady. The Fillmore East crowd was always passionate but slightly more reserved than West Coast audiences. New York music fans prided themselves on being discerning, harder to impress, and Jimi respected that. He didn't have to do the full spectacle for them, he could actually play, let the music do the work, and trust they would follow. The setlist that night was ambitious. They would open with Stone Free, move into Red House, build toward Purple Haze, and then close with an extended version of Voodoo Child that could stretch past 15 minutes if the mood was right. But what Jimi didn't know, what no one on stage could have known, was that in the front row, pressed right up against the stage barrier, a woman named Margaret Chen sat with her 9-year-old son Thomas, and she was quietly praying for a miracle. Thomas had been born with optic nerve hypoplasia, a condition that left him with minimal light perception and almost no functional vision. He lived in a world of shapes and shadows, navigating mostly by sound and touch, and while he had adapted remarkably well, Margaret watched her son grow up knowing he would never see a sunset, never read a book with his own eyes, never look into someone's face and see if they were smiling or sad. But Thomas could hear. And more than hear, he could feel music in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Margaret first noticed it when he was 3 years old, the way his whole body would respond to rhythm, the way he could distinguish between instruments in a recording that even she couldn't separate. By the time he was 6, Thomas was teaching himself to play piano by ear, mimicking melodies he heard on the radio with a precision that made his music teacher weep. And his favorite musician, the one whose records he played until the grooves wore thin, was Jimi Hendrix. He would sit with his face inches from the speaker, eyes closed behind his dark glasses, and sway to every note, every bend, every moment of controlled chaos that made Jimi's guitar sound like it was singing in some language older than words. Margaret had saved for 6 months to buy those concert tickets. Money was tight, she was raising Thomas alone, working 2 jobs, and concert tickets were an extravagance she couldn't really afford. But she had seen the way her son's face transformed when Purple Haze came on the radio, and she knew, with the certainty only a mother can have, that Thomas needed to experience Jimi Hendrix live, needed to feel those vibrations in his chest, needed to be in the same room as the music that made him feel less alone. She called the Fillmore East 3 times to make sure they would have accessible seating, and when the ticket agent asked if there was anything special they needed, Margaret explained about Thomas's vision, and the agent, moved by something in her voice, promised her front row seats, right in the center, where Thomas could be as close to the stage as possible. The night of the concert, Thomas was so excited he could barely eat dinner. He wore his best shirt, the one with buttons he had practiced fastening himself, and he carried his white cane even though Margaret would guide him through the venue. On the subway ride to the Fillmore, he kept asking questions. How big is the stage? How many people will be there? Will I really be able to feel the music? Margaret answered each question with as much detail as she could, painting pictures with words for a child who would never see them with his eyes, and she felt her heart breaking and swelling at the same time, loving this boy with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. When they arrived and were shown to their seats, Thomas reached out and touched the edge of the stage, running his small hands along the wood grain, getting his bearings. Margaret watched him map the space in his mind, creating a mental picture from texture and sound, and she thought, not for the first time, that her son experienced the world more deeply than most sighted people ever would. The opening act played, but Thomas barely paid attention. He was waiting for Jimi, his whole body tense with anticipation, his fingers drumming rhythms on his knees that Margaret recognized as Foxy Lady. And then the lights dropped, and the crowd erupted, and Jimi Hendrix walked onto that stage. Thomas couldn't see him, but he could feel the shift in the room, the way 3,000 people collectively leaned forward, the way the air itself seemed to change. And then the first note hit, and Thomas gasped, actually gasped out loud, because the sound wasn't just entering his ears, it was moving through his entire body, vibrating in his chest and his bones and his teeth. Margaret looked down at her son and saw tears streaming down his face from behind his dark glasses, not sad tears but overwhelmed tears, the tears of someone experiencing something so beautiful it hurts. Jimi opened with "Stone Free," and the guitar sounded larger than life, each note so clear and present that Thomas could practically see them in his mind, could visualize the colors his mother had tried to describe to him. He was moving in his seat, swaying, his hands conducting an invisible orchestra, completely lost in the music. Margaret kept one hand on his shoulder, afraid he might somehow fall or get hurt in his excitement, but mostly she just watched him, watched her son be completely, radiantly happy in a way she hadn't seen in months. They moved through Red House, with its slow blues progression that made the room feel smaller and more intimate, and then Jimi announced, "This one's called Purple Haze," and the crowd screamed. Thomas grabbed his mother's hand and squeezed so hard it hurt. This was his song, the one he had memorized every riff of, the one he tried to play on piano even though it was meant for guitar. And when that opening riff hit, when Jimi's fingers hit those first distorted notes, Thomas stood up. He didn't plan it, didn't think about it, he just stood, his hands gripping the edge of the stage, his face tilted up toward the sound, and he started to cry again, but this time he was also smiling, the biggest smile Margaret had ever seen on his face. And that's when Jimi saw him. Later, Mitch would say that Jimi's eyes had been scanning the crowd during the intro, the way they always did, but then they stopped, fixed on something in the front row, and his expression changed. The guitar didn't stop immediately, muscle memory carried the riff for a few more bars, but Jimi's attention was no longer on the music. He was looking at a small boy in dark glasses, standing when everyone else was sitting, his hands white-knuckled on the stage edge, his face a mixture of joy and longing so pure it was almost painful to witness. Jimi had seen thousands of faces in crowds over the years, had looked out into seas of people and mostly seen a blur, but something about this child reached through all of that and grabbed him by the throat. Maybe it was the dark glasses, maybe it was the way the boy's face was tilted up but not quite making eye contact, maybe it was the vulnerable openness of that smile, but Jimi felt something crack open inside his chest. He saw himself at 9 years old, standing outside a music store window, looking at guitars he couldn't afford, feeling that desperate hunger to be part of something beautiful. He saw every lonely kid who had ever felt invisible, and he saw this boy who literally couldn't see but who was feeling the music with his whole being, and Jimi couldn't keep playing a stadium-sized show anymore. This had just become personal. He stopped playing. His hands fell away from the strings mid-riff, and the sudden silence was shocking. Mitch's drums continued for a moment out of confusion, then stopped. Noel looked over, alarmed, thinking there was a technical problem. The crowd murmured, uncertain. But Jimi barely noticed any of it. He walked to the edge of the stage, about 15 feet from where he had been standing, and he knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. He was still holding his guitar, his white Stratocaster, and he leaned forward slightly and said, in a voice that was gentle but loud enough for nearby people to hear, "Hey, little man. What's your name?" Thomas froze. He had heard Jimi Hendrix's speaking voice on television interviews, but this was different. This was real, close, directed at him. Margaret leaned down and whispered, "He's talking to you, baby. He's right in front of you." Thomas's mouth opened and closed a few times before sound came out. "Thomas," he finally managed, his voice small and shaky. Jimi smiled, a real smile, not the performance smile he wore for photographers. "Thomas. That's a strong name. You like music, Thomas?" The boy nodded so hard his glasses nearly fell off. "I love music," Thomas said, his voice getting stronger. "I love your music. You're my favorite. I listen to you every single day." Something in Jimi's expression softened even further, if that was possible. "Every single day? That's a lot of listening. You got a favorite song?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Purple Haze. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." And there was something about the way he said, heard, the emphasis on that word, that made Jimi understand. This child couldn't see. This child lived in darkness, and music was his light. Jimi felt his throat tighten. He glanced back at Mitch and Noel, made a small gesture that said, "Give me a minute," and then he turned back to Thomas. "You want to feel it up close?" he asked. "Like, really up close?" Margaret started to say something, to explain that Thomas was blind, that he couldn't see the guitar, but Jimi was already reaching down, extending his hand. "Is it okay if he comes up here for a second?" he asked Margaret, and she was so shocked she could only nod. Jimmy's roadie appeared from the side of the stage, and together they carefully helped Thomas climb up. The venue security initially moved forward, but Bill Graham, the Fillmore's owner, stopped them with a gesture. 3,000 people watched in absolute silence as this small boy in dark glasses stood on stage next to Jimi Hendrix, looking tiny and overwhelmed and utterly fearless. Jimi guided Thomas to stand right in front of him, positioning him carefully so he wouldn't trip on any cables. Then he took Thomas's hands, small hands that were shaking slightly, and placed them on the body of his guitar. "Feel that?" Jimi said softly. "That's a Fender Stratocaster. This one's been with me a long time." Thomas's fingers explored the guitar's surface, tracing the curves, feeling the strings, the pickups, the smooth paint finish. His face was a study in concentration and wonder. Then Jimi did something that made Margaret start crying quietly in her seat. He positioned himself behind Thomas, wrapped his arms around the small boy so that Thomas's hands were on top of Jimmy's hands on the guitar neck, and he said, "We're going to play together, okay? You and me. Just feel what I do." And then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone known for playing at ear-splitting volumes, Jimi started to play the opening riff of Purple Haze, again, slowly, deliberately, with Thomas's hands resting on top of his, feeling every finger placement, every movement, every vibration of the strings. Thomas's face transformed. He could feel the music being created, could feel how Jimmy's fingers pressed the strings, how the pick struck, how the sound originated from these specific movements. It wasn't just hearing anymore, it was understanding, it was being inside the creation of the thing he loved most in the world. Tears were streaming down his face again, and he was laughing, a high clear laugh of pure joy, and everyone in that venue, 3,000 skeptical New Yorkers who had seen everything, stood in silence watching a rock star give a blind 9-year-old the gift of feeling music born. They played through the entire opening section of Purple Haze, that way, Jimmy's hands guiding Thomas's hands, and when they finished, Jimi leaned down and whispered something in Thomas's ear that no one else could hear. Years later, Thomas would tell interviewers that Jimi had said, "You hear music better than anyone I've ever met. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you're missing something. You got more than most people will ever have." Jimi walked Thomas back to the edge of the stage, and the roadie helped him down, carefully placing him back next to his mother, who was crying so hard she could barely see. Thomas was clutching something in his hand, and when he opened his palm, Margaret saw it was a guitar pick, Jimmy's pick, still warm from his fingers. The crowd erupted in applause, not the wild screaming of a rock concert but something deeper, sustained, almost reverential. People were wiping their eyes. Hardened music journalists who had seen 1,000 shows couldn't look away. Jimi walked back to center stage, picked up his guitar, and said into the microphone, "That's my man Thomas right there. Let's play this one for him proper." And then he launched into Purple Haze, again, from the beginning, but this time he played it with a tenderness and precision that he usually reserved for recording studios, and every note felt like it was being delivered directly to the small boy in dark glasses sitting in the front row, conducting along with hands that had just felt Jimi Hendrix create magic. The concert continued for another hour, but that moment, those 7 minutes when Jimi stopped the show to connect with one child, became the thing people talked about for years afterward. Not the guitar solos, not the stage presence, not the hits, but that moment of humanity. Someone in the audience had a camera and took a single photograph, slightly out of focus, showing Jimi kneeling at the edge of the stage with his hand extended toward Thomas. That photograph was later included in a collection of rare Hendrix images, but the context was lost, and for decades most people who saw it didn't know the story behind it. Margaret Chan kept in touch with some of the people who had been sitting near them that night, and in the years that followed, they would occasionally gather and share their memories, each person remembering slightly different details but all agreeing on the essence: they had witnessed something sacred. Thomas kept that guitar pick for the rest of his life, carried it in his wallet, and when he grew up and became a music teacher working primarily with disabled children, he would tell them the story of the night Jimi Hendrix stopped a concert for him, and he would use it as proof that the world had more kindness in it than the news suggested. When Jimi died 2 years later, Margaret and Thomas were devastated. Thomas was 11 years old, and it was the first time someone he loved, even someone he had only met once, had died. He couldn't understand why someone who had that much music left in him would be gone. Margaret tried to explain about pills and accidents and the pressures of fame, but Thomas just kept saying, "But he was so kind. Why do kind people die?" And Margaret had no answer, because she was wondering the same thing. In 2003, when Rolling Stone was compiling oral histories from people who had known Jimi, a researcher tracked down Margaret through old Fillmore East ticket records, and she told the story publicly for the first time. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people wrote to her, sharing their own stories of Jimi's quiet kindnesses, the times he had stopped to help someone, given money to a struggling musician, visited a sick fan. A pattern emerged of a man who, despite his fame, never forgot what it felt like to be overlooked, and who went out of his way to see the people others ignored. Thomas, by then 44 years old and a respected music educator, was interviewed for the same article. He spoke about how that night had changed his life, not because he met someone famous, but because Jimi had treated him like his blindness didn't make him less capable of understanding music, had in fact suggested it might make him more capable. "He didn't pity me," Thomas said. "He respected me. That's the difference. He saw something in me I didn't even know was there, and he reflected it back, and I've spent my whole life trying to do that for other kids. Every student I teach, I try to find their version of that guitar pick, the thing that will remind them they're not broken, just different." The story of what Jimi did for Thomas that night stands in stark contrast to the mythology that grew up around him after his death, the narrative of excess and self-destruction that dominated the obituaries and retrospectives. Yes, Jimi struggled with fame and substances and the grinding machinery of the music industry, but he was also a person capable of profound empathy, someone whose own childhood wounds had left him with an almost supernatural ability to recognize pain in others and a compulsion to try to ease it when he could. In the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of Jimi Hendrix that doesn't get talked about enough. Not just the revolutionary guitar playing, not just the albums that changed rock music forever, but the countless small moments of connection, the times he stopped being the icon and just became a human being reaching out to another human being. The concert at the Fillmore East on May 10, 1968, continued for 90 minutes, but the 7 minutes when Jimi stopped, Purple Haze, to kneel down and play guitar with a blind 9-year-old boy taught everyone in that room something they wouldn't forget: that genius without kindness is just noise, but genius paired with compassion can change a life. Thomas Chan is 75 years old now, still teaching music, still carrying that guitar pick, still telling the story to anyone who will listen. And every time he tells it, he ends the same way: "Jimi Hendrix saw me when I couldn't see myself. And he showed me that the best music isn't played for thousands of people, it's played for one person who really needs to hear it." That's what I try to remember every time I teach. You never know which moment will be the one that changes everything. The concert Jimi stopped mid-song wasn't a technical failure or a momentary lapse. It was a choice, a conscious decision to value one child's experience over the expectations of thousands, and in making that choice, Jimi Hendrix reminded everyone watching what live music was supposed to be about in the first place: connection, presence, and the possibility that for a few minutes, we might all be seen, heard, and recognized for exactly who we are.